You have been working on yourself for years. The reading, the therapy, the meditation practice, the careful examination of your patterns and beliefs and the wounds that produced them. And you are better for it, genuinely better. And something is still missing. A quality of ease that the self-improvement keeps promising and not quite delivering. A lightness that all the work on the self keeps somehow not producing. The problem might be the framework itself. The framework that says the self is a project to be perfected, that happiness is the result of enough correctly applied effort, that if you just understand yourself fully enough, fix the remaining damage, optimize the remaining patterns, the thing you were looking for will finally arrive. Dogen, a 13th century Japanese Zen master, said something that cuts directly through this framework. To study the self, he said, is to forget the self, and to forget the self is to be enlightened by all things. He did not mean stop growing. He did not mean abandon self-knowledge. He meant that the self-improvement project, taken as an end in itself, is running in the wrong direction. That the deepest freedom is not found by adding more understanding to the self, but by loosening the grip of the self that is doing the understanding. Not self-destruction, self-release. The specific, paradoxical, entirely available discovery that the self you have been so carefully constructing was never as solid as it felt, and that the loosening is not loss, but relief. There is a particular exhaustion that arrives after years of serious self-work. Not the exhaustion of not trying, the exhaustion of a person who has tried very hard, who has learned a great deal about themselves, who has done the legitimate and genuinely valuable work of understanding their history and patterns, and who finds, in the quiet, the self they have been studying and improving is still there, still requiring maintenance, still the thing that everything circles around, still, somehow, heavy. The self-help culture has one answer to this: more work, better techniques, deeper excavation. The assumption that the heaviness is the result of work not yet completed, that the lightness waits on the other side of understanding yourself fully enough. Dogen's answer is different. The heaviness is not the residue of incompletely processed experience. It is the weight of the self as project itself, the constant effort of a person who is always observing themselves, always assessing their progress, always relating to their own experience from the outside, as subject studying object, rather than simply being present to what is happening. The way through is not more understanding. It is the willingness in certain moments to put the understanding down, to stop being the person who is working on themselves and simply be the person who is here. Dogen Zenji was born in 1200 in Kyoto, Japan, into a noble family with connections to the imperial court. His father died when he was 2. His mother died when he was 7. At the deathbed, he watched the incense smoke rising and understood, in the direct, bodily way that a 7-year-old understands things, that everything passes. The understanding did not leave him.
He entered monastic life as a teenager and was ordained in the Tendai school on Mount Hiei, one of the great centers of Japanese Buddhist learning. He had a question that the Tendai tradition could not answer. If original enlightenment is the nature of all beings, if Buddha nature is already fully present in every person, why is practice necessary? Why strive for what you already are? This question drove him to China in 1223, seeking a more direct answer than Japanese Buddhism had given him. He found it at the monastery of Tiantong, under the master Ru Jing. Ru Jing's teaching was simple and absolute. Shikantaza, just sitting. Not sitting to achieve anything, not sitting to understand anything, not sitting as a method toward a goal, just sitting. The complete, ungrasping, unconditional presence to this moment that is, Ru Jing taught, not the path to enlightenment, but the expression of it. Dogen returned to Japan in 1227 transformed. He founded what would become the Soto school of Zen, the largest school of Buddhism in Japan today. He spent the rest of his life teaching and writing, producing the Shobogenzo, the treasury of the true Dharma I, a collection of essays in Japanese of extraordinary philosophical depth and literary beauty. He was 53 when he died in 1553, having compressed into 3 decades of teaching a body of work that Japanese Buddhist scholars have been studying ever since. The Shobogenzo is not easy reading. It is deliberately paradoxical, refusing the systematic clarity that Western philosophy expects, working instead through juxtaposition and image and the specific, destabilizing precision of a thinker who understood that the conceptual mind cannot grasp its own ground, and that the attempt to explain Zen too clearly is the attempt to catch water in a net. But the central instruction is simple. It is one of the most famous sentences in Japanese philosophy. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be enlightened by the 10,000 things. What does this mean? To study the self is the project we know, the examination, the analysis, the building of self-knowledge. This is necessary. Dogen does not dismiss it. But studying the self produces a particular kind of knower, a self that stands apart from its experience in order to examine it, a self that is always, to some degree, other than what it is studying, always watching, always assessing, always one step removed from direct experience, because the examiner must maintain its position in order to examine. To forget the self is the move Dogen is pointing at, not amnesia, not the destruction of self-knowledge, the temporary, repeated, increasingly available release of the examining stance, the willingness to be inside the experience rather than observing it, to let the boundary between the experiencer and the experienced become for a moment permeable, to be fully in the sitting rather than watching yourself sit, fully in the conversation rather than monitoring how you are coming across, fully in the task rather than assessing your performance of it. What happens in these moments? Dogen says, you are enlightened by the 10,000 things. The world comes in. Not the world filtered through the self's categories and assessments and the constant low-level commentary that the examining mind produces. The actual world, this tree, this sound, this face, this moment, received directly, without the self getting in the way. This is what Shikantaza is, just sitting. Not sitting while watching yourself sit, not sitting while noting the quality of your concentration. Sitting, full stop. The self released into the activity so completely that the distinction between the sitter and the sitting dissolves, and what remains is neither self nor no self, but the simple, full, wordless presence of a person who is entirely where they are.
The paradox that Dogen is living inside is this. You cannot achieve the forgetting of self by trying to forget the self. The effort to forget the self produces another self, the self that is trying to forget itself. The only way through is the complete, unconditional commitment to the practice, not as a method toward a goal, but as the expression of the thing itself. You sit not to become enlightened. You sit as the expression of the Buddha nature that is already your nature. You act not to become a good person. You act from the good nature that is already present. The practice is not the cause of the awakening. It is the awakening, expressed in action, every time it is genuinely entered. This resolves the question Dogen brought to China. Why practice if enlightenment is already your nature? Because the practice is how the nature expresses itself, not the road to the destination walking. Now, the bridge. Because Dogen was a 13th century Japanese Zen monk writing in the specific context of Soto school Buddhism, and most people watching this video are not Zen monks. But here is what translates directly. The meeting you were so busy monitoring your performance in that you missed the actual conversation. The meal eaten while reviewing the day rather than tasting the food.
the walk that was technically outdoors but entirely inside the head, the relationship where so much attention is going to how you are being perceived that the actual person across from you is receiving a performance rather than a presence. These are not failures of mindfulness in the app-based sense. They're the natural result of the self as a project, the person who has learned to observe themselves so consistently that the observing has become the default mode even in the moments that most require simple presence. Dogen is not asking you to stop the self-examination entirely. He is asking you to know the difference between the moments that call for it and the moments that call for something else, between the useful examination and the habitual monitoring that keeps you one step removed from the life you are actually living. And he is offering in Shikantaza, in just sitting, just walking, just being fully where you are without the self-commentary, a practice that is not about the self at all. That is the relief you have been working toward without knowing it. Here is what Dogen asks of you today. First, find one activity and do it without monitoring yourself doing it. The eating, the walking, the conversation, the work. Choose one, and for the duration of that activity, let the observer step back. Not permanently. The observer serves real purposes. For this hour, for this meal, for this exchange, be inside the activity, rather than watching yourself be inside it. Let the self that is always assessing how it is doing become briefly the self that is simply doing.
This sounds easy. It is not easy, but it gets easier. And what it reveals, even in the first attempt, is the specific wordless quality of presence that all the self-work was always trying to produce, and that only arrives when the self-work pauses. Second, practice Shikantaza, just sitting. Not meditation as self-improvement. Sit for 10 minutes with no goal except the sitting itself. Not observing the quality of the sitting, not noting the thoughts as they arise and pass, simply being present to this, the breath, the body, the room, the moment, without trying to get anything from it, without the posture of the person who is meditating, with the simple, ungrasping presence of a person who is here. When the self-commentary begins, when you start noting how the sitting is going, whether you are doing it correctly, return, not with judgment. Return the way Dogen returned, as the natural expression of the nature that was never absent. Just sitting. Again. The return is not the failure of the practice. It is the practice. Third, ask where you are monitoring instead of living. Not a long excavation, a brief, honest question daily. In the last 24 hours, where was I monitoring my performance of the experience rather than having the experience? Where was the examining self in the way of the living self? Not to feel guilty about it, to see it. The seen pattern has less power than the unseen one, and the seeing, quiet, non-judgmental, Dogen-grade amist, is the beginning of the release. Fourth, let one thing be enough. Dogen's teaching on the present moment is not about productivity. It is not about doing one thing at a time for efficiency. It is the deeper recognition that this moment, this completely ordinary, unrepeatable, fully available moment contains everything that is needed. Not that it is perfect, not that it lacks nothing you wish were different, that it is complete, that the person who is fully present to it has, in a sense that Dogen would recognize, everything. Let one ordinary moment today be enough. The cup of tea that is just the cup of tea. The conversation that is fully received, the 5 minutes of sitting in which the self-improvement project is briefly, gracefully set down.
That is the practice. To study the self is to forget the self. The studying gets you to the edge of what studying can do, and then, in the putting down of the study, in the simple, complete presence to what is here, the thing the study was always pointing at arrives. I want to close with the image Dogen leaves me with. Not the Shobogenzo, not the monastery or the teaching or the 30 years of extraordinary philosophical output. The 7-year-old at his mother's bedside, watching the incense smoke rise. The child who understood in the direct, preconceptual way that children sometimes understand things, that everything passes, that the moment is all there is, that the smoke that rises does not ask whether it is rising correctly. He spent the next 46 years building a philosophy sophisticated enough to say what the 7-year-old already knew, to give the adult mind the tools to return to what the child experienced directly, before the self-examination, before the project, before the constant observing of the smoke while it rises. Just this, just now. The self, forgotten into the world it was always part of, the incense smoke, rising. Here is the question Dogen leaves us with today. Where has the studying of the self become the substitute for the living of it? Where is the examining self so present that the experience it is examining is being missed? And what is one thing, one activity, one conversation, one ordinary moment today that you could be fully inside of rather than observing from the outside? Leave that in the comments, because naming the place where you have been watching instead of being is the beginning of the return. And the return, unglamorous, available, requiring no special conditions, is what Dogen meant by enlightenment. Not a distant destination, this moment, fully entered. I'll see you in the next one.